yourself and take it away. Update us with what's happening in the world.
Yeah, I'll do my best. Thank you, Pat, for the nice introduction. Thank you also, Amon. I don't know if Amon is there right now. I'm assuming he's in the audience. I want to thank everybody for just coming today and allowing me the chance to say a few words. I'm going to try to be as brief as I can, although admittedly I'm going to hit some big topics, starting with some current events, and then I'm going to try to take a step back into the bigger picture, just to give people a sense of some of the context and causality, why the world is moving through I guess you could say, the storm that we are moving through, and some of the pathways out of this storm that could be taken if people choose to be wise, or at least not abide by folly, which has been too far the custom for far too long, which has resulted in the buildup of tension and the buildup of many lies that have become tolerated to the point that we now have a bubble time bomb of an economic system in the West. I mean, the banking system that we once had that used to invest in building infrastructure, that used to, invest in creating things and applying new technologies to improving the conditions of life of people. That used to, before I was born and before many of us here in the audience even were born, I think, that used to be the way I've read our society was wired, especially after World War II, where you had 25 years of prosperity, emerging out of the war. Most of the infrastructure here in Canada, where I live, was built during that 1945 to 1970 something period. And then something happened in the early 70s. When a bit of a sleight of hand was induced, and there was a transformation. I think that a very important key moment, and I'm presuming that there's a good degree of knowledge in the minds of the people listening. I think all of you guys have been coming together for quite some time, listening to presentations so I'm not going to go to the birds and the bees and go to the beginning. I'm presuming that everyone is aware that we are living through a systemic breakdown of some nature. And a fight over what the new system, the new operating system will look like coming online after this thing that has come to be known as Great Reset occurs. So what caused that? I think a very key moment is this period of 1971, when there was something that occurred in the United States. For those who don't know, this was a period where Bobby Kennedy had just been assassinated. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. It was recently the anniversary of King's murder, about 4 days ago. John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X earlier had been killed. In Europe, you had leaders like Enrico Mattei, the great industrialist who had a great vision for the development of Africa and the breaking of colonialism. He was killed in something associated with Operation Gladio, which was a NATO CIA utilization of stay-behinds from Italy and from Germany that continued to carry out fascist operations, including terrorist operations and cells of terrorists and cells within cells that ran all over Europe, including into Canada, carrying out things that killed civilians, but as well a lot of targeted statesmen, people like Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General, whose plane had also been sabotaged, just as Enrico Mattei's. There had been many others. The ouster of de Gaulle had occurred in 1969. And so coming out of the wake of the elimination of many of these statesmen who had been trying to induce and defend a certain type of economic order founded upon industrial progress, the development of the powers of labor of not just their own countries in France or Germany or Italy or the United States, but rather extend the right for every nation, including nations of Europe, of Africa, of South America, of India, of Asia, to also access those technologies and those industrial abilities to stand on their own 2 feet with full spectrum economies. That was all crushed. And with them out of the way, you had what was done in 1971 with the separation of the dollar, the US dollar, which was the basis of international exchange, right? Everybody had to own US dollars to have any form of balance of payments satisfied in any form of exchange since 1944 or 45. So after that, there was like a cutting off of the US dollar from the fixed exchange rate system, which was a system that had been set into motion as part of the Bretton Woods, which ensured that speculation on local currencies could not happen. You had a relative fixing of everything relative to the price of gold at around $35 an ounce. And that allowed for a certain ability to think long-term, because if you're not allowing speculators to gamble on the prices of currencies, you have a creation of an environment of stability, right? So if you're a businessman, you can think now 5-10 years in the future about the relative parity of prices, and you could build large-scale infrastructure. That takes time before it garners feedback, a payback, right? If you're going to build something really big, it takes a lot of patience before it's going to start giving you return on investment. After 1971, when the dollar was floated to the floating exchange rate, and then within 2 years to the petrodollar, to the price of oil from the OPEC countries, meaning that what Kissinger ensured in both cases was that any sale of oil, whether on the spot markets, on the futures markets, had to be settled in US dollars. So that basically created a condition where speculative activity became the determinant of what gave the dollar value. And at that moment, there was a myopia had set in. And instead of thinking about large-scale real investments, the real economy, is your money playing a role in benefiting people's lives, benefiting your nation, that was severed. That standard was broken. And we increasingly became focused on generating at maximum returns on profit within the next maximum 2-3 quarters. There's been an adage in business that somehow came about, I've been told by many people, that unless you can prove that an investment can garner payback within 3 years, it's not worth doing. I can tell you that's a really bad way of doing business if you're thinking about 8 billion lives on the earth. So with that new logic, a consumer society cult was set in. The US started outsourcing its industries, its manufacturing. So did Canada, so did a lot of Europe, to cheap labor markets. We know what happened. The logic was, well, we can pay Mexicans, or we could pay people in Asia a very low wage, $1 an hour or less, to do the work we used to do, for higher pay and for better quality work, using high technology. We can scrap that and instead use cheap labor, sweatshops, and ensure more profit. We're going to not produce the things we used to. And as a consequence, the West lost their economic sovereignty. We lost the ability to produce for ourselves, and we became dependent upon keeping nations poor, because the second now all of a sudden these nations started, if they were to ever really develop themselves and have a higher standard of life and better quality of education, better quality of infrastructure, their labor would become more expensive, which would then break the formula. So we had to now justify keeping these different nations in the dirt. So I'm just going to take a sip of my coffee. It's a bit early here. So with that came this idea of deregulation, right? With the deregulated system, nations no longer were told protectionism is the old wisdom, right? The idea that you could have a dirigist economy with protection to protect your local manufacturers or farmers, that's the old wisdom. The new wisdom is everything goes. We deregulated the banks to allow for mergers and acquisitions. We saw what happened in the late 70s throughout the 80s with the creation of these corporations that had increasingly more clout than sovereign governments. And universal banking set in, starting with things like the Big Bang in England under Margaret Thatcher, right? Which was this idea that we will create universal banking. No longer are we going to keep our banking activities separated between investment versus commercial banks or insurance or trusts that all have to be kept under separate roofs. No. It's going to be more efficient if we just let everything merge into these big multi-headed Hydra beasts where you could do one-stop shop banking in one shot. And with that, speculators began to, for the first time since 1933, have access to savings, to commercial banks. So deposits that were supposed to be assigned purely for the real economy became now put increasingly into speculative activity. Things like Alan Greenspan's normalization of derivatives, what he called creative financial instruments, which was something that was done in 1987 to solve the Black Tuesday of October. I think it was October 25th, 1987, when the whole economy nearly went into another Great Depression, right? The stock markets lost 25% of their value in one day. And everyone was worried we were going into another 1929 depression. So, and we were, except unlike 1929, Alan Greenspan, who was there at the helm this time at the Federal Reserve, said, okay, the solution is we are going to take these things you used to get thrown into jail doing, junk bond sales, right? Things that Michael Milken had gotten, a scam artist, had gotten put into prison for. And we're going to now make this a normal part of the economy. So you can not only just take junk bonds, and there's a whole variety of bad debts, and you can now put insurance on them and gamble on the price of the value of the insurance, either, you know, next week, next month, next year. We'll give them a variety of names. And these derivatives went from, I think, a total, last time I checked, in 1991 of about $2 trillion in 1991 was the total valuation of derivatives. That process took on a life of its own, or a death of its own, if you want to think of it that way. And by 1999, when Bill Clinton destroyed Glass-Steagall, it had grown to about $78 trillion very quickly. That had outpaced the world GDP. By 2007, just to get this rate of growth of this cancerous tumor in place that took over the economy, by 2007, when the housing market blew out in the USA, with also ramifications across Europe and beyond, this had grown to $750 trillion, this derivative bubble. That was well over 10 times the world GDP by that time. That was what was even registered. That was a low estimate. I've seen economists who have said, if you take all of the variables into consideration, including a lot of what goes on in the British Cayman Islands, a lot of the stuff is covered up. It's probably today well over 1.2 to 1.5 quadrillion dollars, about 20 times the world GDP. This is the bubble that was not resolved in 2008, when we did have a chance to restore Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall being, for those who don't know, I said this was that Britain had done something in 1986 called the Big Bang, the breaking up of the walls separating the functions of banking. It took a little bit longer for that to occur in the United States, which was the real target. When that breaking up of the walls occurred, that was the destruction of Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall was a legislation that Franklin Roosevelt and his allies had put into place in 1933 during a major war against Wall Street, which has largely been scrubbed from our history books, because I think certain people who write our history books don't want us to know how they were put on a leash and punished for funding fascism back in the 1930s. A lot of the Wall Street and London banks that were trying to sell Americans, Canadians, Europeans that the economic miracle solution to all of the problems of the Great Depression, which was again orchestrated by them and the bubbles that they created in the 1920s, artificially, and then popped in a coordinated fashion in 1929. A lot of these bankers don't want us today to know how and why they were broken and brought back into obedience with a higher national law. So we don't get to hear too much about Glass-Steagall properly. However, this is the story. So you had back then, Franklin Roosevelt was pretty much the only anti-fascist candidate coming out of the United States who was really aware of the nature of this bankers' conspiracy to sell us Hitler, Mussolini, corporate fascism. There's a whole bunch of flavors of fascism as the solution after 4 years of trauma, right? Like, people had been really traumatized. The unemployment rate was 25 to 30% in the United States. There was starvation, death on the streets. People were starving to death. The industrial output in 1932 was at 50% capacity what it was in 1929. You had the biggest wealth transfer as well. So for those who were in the know of the oncoming economic collapse, the bubble that was popped in 1929, for those bankers who were on people like the JP Morgan preferred clients list, which was revealed during these public hearings that were conducted by Congress in 1933. There were such things as the preferred clients lists, where these people had, it was insider trading. So all of these people like Joe Kennedy, the father of John Kennedy. Kennedy was luckily a patriot who was disgusted by what his father and family were doing, but his father was a scumbag who was a funder of a lot of very bad things. All that to say, George Prescott Bush, the patriarch of the Bush family, working for Brown Brothers Harriman at the time, was on these lists. So were many people in both parties. They were all able to sell their stocks short before the bubble was blown up, and then buy up massively for pennies on the dollar. in the ensuing 1930, 31, 32, and you had this wealth transfer. So despite the fact that all of this wealth, the industrial factories, the farms, the property, all move into the hands of just a small little clique, and regular people lost their lives, they had their savings wiped out. Despite that, you would think, okay, well, if these capitalists, so-called, really were capitalists, they would want to make money. They would want to utilize their newly controlled farms and industries to produce things. But that's not what happened. They instead put the brakes on, and they shut down, to the point that, like I said, 50% of industrial productivity was killed by 1932 that had been in existence a few years earlier. Same thing for farms. You had foreclosure after foreclosure, but you weren't seeing any real growth. You had the opposite happening. So it's like there was something other than making money that was a priority at the time. And as a solution to the trauma, again, like I said, Time magazine was more than happy to publish things like Mussolini 8 times before World War II on their cover. And during World War II, it was big. You had Nazi rallies in Madison Square Garden, New York. You can see the pictures of George Washington and Adolf Hitler and the swastika in New York, with crowds filling 40, 50,000 Madison Square Gardens, with these giant Nazi rallies walking down the streets of Fifth Avenue in New York. Same thing for Quebec. I've seen pictures here. A lot of great, people who are grandparents today are a little bit ashamed to admit. And so they don't pass down these important lessons to their kids and grandkids, that in the 1930s and even into the 40s in Quebec, we had a major Nazi movement under a fellow named Adrien Arcand, who was the Quebec Nazi. And there's, again, pictures of just huge conferences and parades of Nazis with Quebec and Canadian symbols walking down the streets, offering, again, food on your table, a job, security, and people were willing to accept things they never, ever would have accepted during a time of stability and democracy, or at least where the illusion of democracy had not been ripped from their lives. So getting back to the story, how did that stop? Why didn't that succeed? Right? Why have we not been goose stepping now for the past 80 years? Is a big paradox, right? And I think this is a useful thought experiment, because the financier oligarchy, which has been manipulating for many, many generations, there has been a financier oligarchy. And anybody who tries to talk about history, either recent history or deep history, without taking into consideration the continuous existence of a hive of bloodlines of families who have been maintaining a power structure above the systems of government, of national government, they're fools. They're not gonna, they might give you an explanatory model of like something that happened at any point in time, but it won't involve any causality. And thus you will have no insight into how to use historical lessons from any history book in terms of how does this impact or empower you in the world you live in? Because we are living in history, right? We will be dead at some point. That's the fact of being a human. And there will be future people becoming historians, thinking back and studying our world and thinking, what were the choices? What were the ideas that were tolerated or fought for by people who lived? So that's an important subjective thing to keep in mind, right, when you're looking at history. So the ignoring of this oligarchical continuity is a big problem. So the reason why is, again, when you realize that there is this thing, it often screws up. I think I'm allowed to, there's no young people here, right, in the audience. I can swear if I want to. I'm not being censored, am I? By YouTube or anything? Okay, yeah, they fuck up a lot, right? Like when you look at whenever the oligarchy actually achieves the sort of systems of control that they so desire, whether it was the Roman Empire, where they were able to consolidate maximum power, create a situation of maximum stupidification in their target victims, and maximum exploitation and slavery. Whenever they achieve those desires of control, what happens is that they, like any parasite that overdoes it, that overdrinks the blood of their host, the host dies. Now the parasite doesn't benefit. The Roman oligarchy that thought they were benefiting by reaping the fruits of the labor of slaves across the Roman Empire, especially on the outskirts, and keeping their civilians in the capital as dumb and bloated on bread and circuses. Rome, 250 days of the year in Rome was festivals. free-flowing wine, bread, and circuses, watching gladiators killing Christians, all of that. It was just part of the opiate of the masses, right? But the effect of that was that you destroy the lifeblood of your economy. The actual ability for the society to sustain itself is contingent on the individual sacredness of personal lives, which have the ability to make new discoveries and share them and introduce new technologies, new ways of thinking into the system, which that type of creative flexibility is a precondition for that very system's survival. When a system becomes too crystallized and too hyper adapted to one set of circumstances, to the point that it bans new technologies, it destroys creative thought, it all of a sudden goes into what you might consider atrophy. It's like, not going to the gym, for a while. You might have gone to the gym for a while, you were eating good, and then all of a sudden you just stopped and you're thinking, okay, well, I was well behaved now for some time. I've got some muscles, I can feel good, and all of a sudden you just stop trying. You just start like eating chocolate and enjoying the sensual part of your life and just being lethargic, turning off your brain. And sure, your body will atrophy, right? You're no longer going outside of yourself. And the more you atrophy, the less you could sustain your existence. The more you create these boundary conditions for yourself, which cut off your longevity, right? You come to a place where things break down more easily. And unless you get back into the good habits, you will have an early death. And it's like that for a human system, except the difference being that the human system, as far as a society, is not limited by the same biological forces. A society has some spiritual, qualities which go beyond one life or two lives, or it could even be feasibly, theoretically, a society could be immortal, whereas everybody is guaranteed to be mortal. But a society could be maybe immortal if you constantly have that flexibility to what you might call go through renaissances, rejuvenate, right? And go back to your core founding principles, which give you legitimacy and give you a creative flexibility. So oligarchical systems don't do that. They're not good at creative flexibility, and they end up, like I said, destroying their hosts. The oligarchical families themselves didn't benefit. They had to go and some of them backstabbed each other during the time of crisis when Rome was collapsing. Some of them that came out on top as alpha dogs that survived the backstabbing. Went on to safer ground outside of Rome in the lagoons of Venice, and they reorganized themselves, which became, Venice for about 800 years became a new center of world evil. Global finance, global bullion, international maritime trade really became monopolized by the Venetian system of banking. This was the grouping that ran and financed the Four Crusades to try to create these different clash of civilization dynamics. Between East and West, getting their idiot Christian stooges to have this romantic vision, like Richard of Lionheart, who was sold as this folk hero during the day, but he was just a mercenary warlord who was given these delusions of grandeur to go and take back Jerusalem. And with that, it was just a bloodbath of, again, Muslim versus Christian wars. Sometimes Christian versus Christian wars too, like the 1201 or 1202 Fourth Crusade, which involves a bunch of Christians from the West going, and instead of taking the Holy Land, these guys, funded again by Venice, were induced to do what? On their way, they couldn't pay for their boats to get the soldiers over to the Holy Land, and so to get the money, they were convinced by Venetian diplomacy, well, why don't you go and sack Constantinople over there? They got a lot of money, and these idiots went and did it. And you had Constantinople was a Christian kingdom, which was annihilated, massacred. And that's why when you go to Venice today and you see the pictures of the weird architecture in St. Mark's Square, and all over the lagoons of Venice, you got this weird Byzantine architecture. It's because they stole it all from Constantine back the city back in 1201. So they just stole all of their museum pieces and laid waste to Constantinople. So this is also a zone which had control of Mongol hordes. I mean, it's an interesting fact of history that the Mongols, which had global, it's like a global fascist vision for dominating the world, were ruthless. And yet they were very effective at carrying out successful battles to destroy every single kingdom they came into contact with. And they just cleaned up shop all the way into Kiev and Rus and all the way into Eastern Europe and down through the India and everywhere. So how did this grouping of people who didn't have a lot of political savvy or sophistication or diplomatic skill, how were they able to do what they did and seem to know the weaknesses of every single kingdom they came into contact with? Well, one clue is that the Venetians were the only grouping that had a monopoly right to trade within Mongolian territory, starting from Marco Polo, actually before Marco Polo and his father, before that even. But it really got big, and Marco Polo became an advisor to the Khans, Kublai Khan. There's some, for those, I think some people probably know that there's even like Netflix make-believe revisionist history that's been sold to us about some of this. But no, the Venetians were known as being the center of intelligence. They were the best. Even today, the Venetian diplomatic dispatches are the best. They're still published a lot, or you can still see archives of these things, where they were the best at mapping out the courts, their diplomatic network, because they also had the control of postal services, being a maritime monopoly, along with their sister city-state Genoa. They had control of all of the postal services, so they were able to read people's literature. They were able to read dispatches between kingdoms. Their profiling of figures within kingdoms, within the courts, is some of the most insightful, evil insights where they were always looking for what were the weak points of psychology of your target court. Who were the people who you could get on your payroll? Kind of like the CIA does, or MI6 does, in looking for who can be bought, right, in your target nation you want to infiltrate and subvert. That's what they were already doing and mastering quite well. And they also had a lot of insights into how could you induce a kingdom to self-destruct. This is what Shakespeare was exposing. For those who like a little bit of classical literature, you could pick up the play Othello. And I highly recommend reading Othello with this in mind, and Shakespeare as a political operative in mind, in terms of like, what was he trying to expose, both for the people with one set of lessons, but also for the elite around the court of Elizabeth, who needed to understand how their nation of England was being taken over by this Venetian hive at that time that Shakespeare was writing in the 1590s and early 17th century. Because this is the character of Iago. If you want to know the Venetians, when Othello is set in Venice, he does that for a reason. He also sets the Merchant of Venice in Venice, obviously. Iago, what is Iago? Honest Iago. Everyone trusts Iago, right? Honest Iago, they call him. And he's the best friend of Othello, this great Moor, a war hero, a general who's done great things in defense of Venice. And he's got such great qualities of a leader. A beautiful young wife from Venice, from one of the high noble families, who loves him and adores him, Desdemona, and a great loyal friend as well, who it will die for him. So he's got so much going for him, and he was a former slave, a black slave, who ended up getting out of slavery and rising through his virtue to the heights of power and excellence as a general. And despite this, there's this character Iago, who is sort of like a lieutenant in his court, but somebody he somehow trusts, and everybody trusts this guy, who is driven by this deep-seated evil and this hate, but nobody can see it. And this guy just wants to destroy Othello so badly. And what does he do? What is his technique? He identifies that Iago has weaknesses, has jealousies, has insecurities, because he's obviously from a slave background, and he's married to this beautiful young girl who loves him from a family who despises him because he's black, think Look Who's Coming Home for Dinner, right? It was scandalous. And so he's got these insecurities, and Iago, being a Iago, is constantly just whispering in people's ear and inflaming people's paranoia, their jealousies, their suspicions, to the point that he gets Othello's best friend to conduct an atrocity, to get him, basically gets him completely drunk and has him do something terrible. Sorry, I just had to mute somebody there. And completely undermine his own authority in the court. And then he ultimately has even Othello kill his wife out of a jealous rage, his loyal, devoted wife. He kills her, thinking that Iago's gossip was true and that she was cheating on him with his best friend and all of this. And he basically gets everybody to self-destruct. This is Venetian techniques. You do court whispers, court gossip, psychological warfare, and you get people to disobey their own self-interest and act in accordance with as instruments of the will of those who actually want to kill them. China's got a certain sense of how to deal with this. So does Russia lately. Where the Chinese Wang Yi was this master diplomat he made it very clear, like, why are the United States right now are trying to tell us to cut off all ties with Russia. It's like our enemy telling us who our enemies are. You don't do that. Russia's been totally loyal. They are on the exact same page about the nature of the beast. So why would we allow all of this gossip? We're being given intelligence by the CIA, which has obviously been caught red-handed for 60 years trying to destroy us. Why would we all of a sudden start trusting them? So that was smart. The thing with Iago and people in England at the time is, before that you had Henry VIII, which really let in a lot of this Venetian slime that persuaded him to break up the church in order to have his divorce met so that he could then create his own church with the king as the head of the church. All that so that he could get laid basically with Anne Boleyn. And who was counseling him this whole time? It was his Venetian marriage counselor, Francesco Zorzi, a Venetian monk who somehow rose to become the trusted advisor of King Henry VIII. Henry VIII. And to the point that even people who were offering a semblance of reason and creative solution, like Henry VIII's former teacher, Thomas More, the man who became prime minister effectively of England, Lord Chancellor, he just cut his head off. He was, and Thomas More and Erasmus, people like that were offering a real gateway out of the type of bloodbath of religious wars that Henry VIII was falling into. And this only got worse and worse by the time Shakespeare came around 80 years later and was writing. And I would say England was fully taken over by around 1688 with the Glorious Revolution. And by 1710, you had the Bank of England created, modeled on the Bank of Amsterdam, the world's first private central bank. Before that, the Bank of Amsterdam was modeled on the Bank of Venice and the Venetian Levant Company, which was sort of the first institution to fulfill that role of a private central bank above the power of nations and independent thereof. So this is what took over England in 1688. It basically purged England of its Thomas More, Erasmian, Shakespearean traditions. People like Queen Anne, who was somebody who at various times was trying to revive the better traditions and empower Thomas More followers like Jonathan Swift. Robert Harley, who became prime minister, was a follower of this better view of England as a nation, not as an empire. We're trying to fight against this grouping of, they weren't Freemasons yet, but it was Rosicrucian. It was a satanic thing. Things like the Hellfire Club were coming online. Things that you would sort of, today, anybody who looks at Jeffrey Epstein's island and some of the inner fetishes of some of these elite inner parties, when you look at things like Eyes Wide Shut, this is not a new thing, the Stanley Kubrick movie. This is already going on in the Hellfire Clubs back in the 1600s. So these people who were actually moral bastions of fight, of resistance against it, were purged by 1710. Robert Harley was put in London Tower. A lot of the figures were either assassinated or just ousted completely from power. And England, by that time, I don't think it really ever had a chance at that point to avoid becoming an empire or the new host. So you can think of it as that, right? I said host. So the new host of the Venetian parasite, which had formerly been, Venice had been the host of the Roman oligarchical families that had destroyed that had earlier destroyed people like Cicero, who was trying to keep Rome from becoming an empire. Cicero was kind of like the Thomas More of ancient Rome, right? Where there was a fight. Will Rome be an empire or will it remain a republic? Will it have, what will be its destiny? And so people like Cicero had to be destroyed. His head was cut off. He was assassinated. And with that, Rome just lost its morality and went for 450 years, 500 years into empire evil mode, and sowed the seeds for its own collapse. Sort of the same thing happened. I mean, Cicero was a Platonist. People would try to say, "What are you? Are you an Epicurean or are you a Stoic?" He's like, "No, I'm neither one of those. Why do I have to choose one extreme or the other? Why? I'm a Platonist." And you could see it in his writings, in his Platonic dialogue. Cicero was a hardcore, loving Platonist. Plato, what was Plato? Plato was somebody who was working. He was trying to fulfill the dream of his teacher, Socrates. What was he doing? What was Socrates doing? They were trying to stop Athens earlier in the 399 period to 300 period. They were trying to stop Athens from its own self-destruction, from falling from being a bastion of liberty, a temple of democracy, which had been established under Solon earlier. And they wanted to stop it from becoming a tool of the temples of Delphi and Apollo, the cult of Apollo at Delphi, sorry. And becoming an empire. They were trying to stop that, and they were doing it by the dialogues that we see now traces of, where Socrates was trying to expose the sophistry, the utilization of beautiful arguments to cover an evil intention, so that people couldn't see intention anymore. They could just be persuaded by sophistry, the art of persuasion, the art of rhetoric, to the point that they would allow corrupt, selfish, hedonistic beasts to become the representatives and lead them into wars that backstabbed Athens' allies, like Sparta and others from the Delian League, that had been formerly a great alliance together that had put down the Persian hordes. Persia at that time, take a step back here, okay? Persia was the martial lord for Babylon. So this was the kind of like America after World War II has become the martial lord for the British Empire. If you think of what's really been controlling America's foreign policy, what's been controlling the growth and the creation of the CIA in 1947, and the purge of American nationalists and patriots after Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945, and all of his allies who believed in crushing the British Empire, who believed in a world of win-win cooperation with a Russia-China-US alliance as the bedrock, who wanted to internationalize the New Deal, to internationalize the practices of national banking globally into Africa, into South America, with great designs for extending electrification of Africa that had been done so successfully in the backwater Tennessee Valley South of America during the 1930s. Who did that? It was the British. So the British were the ones who orchestrated, with their very savvy Venetian modeled intelligence techniques. They were the ones who were able to manufacture this takeover of the functions of the US establishment. They already had agents operating within the US for a long time. This had been something which was never purged in 1776. A lot of them did get purged, right? The United Empire Loyalists in 76. And they left and created what's called English Canada. Before that, it was just a tiny French colony. So some of them left and they said, okay, we want to remain loyal to the British Empire and the old hereditary structures of power that has been the only way society had been organized before 1776. They want to remain loyal to that. And they were given safe sanctuary and territory in Canada. And that's why we have, again, like I said, English speakers in Canada who sound American, look American, but really have a very different philosophical, cultural, constitutional tradition. There's something good and humanist within Canada too, don't get me wrong, but there's something a lot more weird, as well, as people saw with the truckers rally, the Freedom Convoy, that just by pushing a little bit on a demand for something like inalienable rights and freedom, it activated an entire shadow government around the Privy Council, using oaths of secrecy, secret information, confiscating of people's bank accounts, illegal arrests with no constitutional protections. Because we have a Privy Council and a monarchy in Canada. We still have a monarchical system of government with a shadow government embedded as a deep state within the framework of our system, whereas the US has a deep state, but it's not enshrined constitutionally in their government. For them, they actually have something that is viable and principled at their core, and their deep state is something that's latched on. Ours is the inverse. So we all have deep states, but we got to see what's their character. The US has had a fifth column. They've had British loyalists remain behind with the veneer of being patriotic Americans, but have always been kind of like the Nazi stay-behinds, right, of Operation Gladio. They've been stay-behinds, working from the inside to corrupt and destroy America from within. That's been part of America's history. So this grouping, this tradition, this rot, which was behind things like the destruction of the national banks of America, the assassinations of the 8 American presidents who died while in office. 8. I mean, think about that. That's a lot of presidents for one young country to have died while in office. 4 by bullets, 4 by poison. Then if you add people like Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, who had presidential material, both add Alexander Hamilton, who was assassinated by the founder of Wall Street, Aaron Burr, in 1804. You got 10 presidential characters of America who died while in office. Look at what's behind them. Look at what there's a certain constancy. So all of this hive, this fifth column, this deep state was empowered after World War II to purge the patriots and create things like the CIA, the Anglo-American Special Relationship, which was behind the takeover and the undoing of the dream that Roosevelt had of a world of win-win cooperation governed by large-scale infrastructure and science projects together in a world of cooperation. Things like the United Nations, originally, if you look at its charter, there's a reason why people like Zelensky today, who just gave a speech yesterday to the United Nations, Zelensky is called as a total, I mean, this guy is a complete puppet. His whole life has been a construct by actual billionaires like Igor Kolomoisky, who's a big financier of Nazi Azovs, right? This guy is nominally like a Zionist Israeli, but you're like, why is this guy also funding as a Jew? Why is he funding the Azovs? The Nazis that have been empowered to carry out atrocities since 2014. It's because when you go to the higher echelons, there's no differentiation of these different instruments. This is how you can get Christian fundies in the United States around Zbigniew Brzezinski and the neocons in the 1970s, justifying funding radical jihadi groups and madrasas of Wahhabite Islam in Afghanistan and Pakistan and beyond in the 1970s, 80s to carry out jihad against the Soviet Union. That's how you could do that, because ultimately both these end times neoconservative type of perverse, nominally Christians but not, who took control of government were actually Trotskyites before that. They actually just will use anything as a tool to advance an agenda politically. So they could profile that Americans were susceptible to Christianity, and so they used the veneer of it, but to pass a geopolitical agenda that justified a scorched earth policy and the funding of radical sects that became the basis for the Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and now we could see also the same justification of the utilization of Nazi stay-behinds that were continuously not punished after World War II, were absorbed by Allen Dulles, who was running the CIA, a Council on Foreign Relations head, into the US Anglo-American intelligence agencies in the Cold War to fight the Soviets, to fight communism, and everything became justified, right? And this is why it shouldn't be a surprise that Igor Kolomoisky, the billionaire, has been not only doing that, but that you have jihadists from Syria that have been continuously used for regime change in Libya and Syria by the CIA, by the White Helmets, by MI6, and they've been funneled into at least 450, I think it's a lot more now, into Ukraine to fight alongside their Nazi brethren of the Azovs and C-14 to carry out jihad against the Russians that they'd been doing since the late 70s anyway. And this is what's behind. If you look at what's behind the current operations in terms of Bucha, we're all being fed propaganda right now that Bucha was this terrible massacre carried out by these Russian orcs, these Mordor-like Russians who are just these demonic figures who just want to kill and rape. And they're actually saying, the American ambassador to the United Nations, she actually in her speech yesterday condemning Russia with no evidence, right? Like all they have are pictures were being given by New York Times and a bunch of claims being made by Azov-connected Nazis working with Ukrainian media and a puppet Zelensky who's in like Poland, talking in front of green screen most of the time. We're being told that Russia is guilty, but there's been no actual inquiry. And the American ambassador to the United Nations literally said Russia is kidnapping children and sending them into concentration camps in Russia. And she said, you all know what that means, referring to Nazi Germany. Like, it's make-believe, but it's over the top. And many people are believing that, despite the fact that, the Russian ambassador to the UN, who is really earning his check, I got to say, if you listen to his speech, you feel for the guy. He called for a UN Security Council meeting. He said in his speech, he did a press conference, and he's like, look, this is the first time in history that a sitting member of the UN Security Council has been rejected. They did not call a meeting for the first time in history. The British are the ones controlling the UN Security Council, by the way. The British are the ones who are trying to get the Saudi Arabians to become members of the Security Council not that long ago, remember, under David Cameron. And he said, we were totally rejected, even though this is obviously an issue of high security. I mean, we're being blamed for this atrocity, and it's justifying a complete cutoff of East-West relations to the degree that there's still a little bit. And he's like, look, there's no rigor mortis. If you just look at the evidence, the basic evidence, expert scientific evidence, look at the pictures of the people who have been killed. Their hands have been tied and they've been executed. These are people who, number one, the profile fits what the Azovs have been doing to prisoners of war and people that they have been kidnapping for the past 8 years, carrying out deaths of over 14,000 people in East Ukraine, Donbass region. But on top of that, there's no rigor mortis in the bodies. These are not bodies that have been dead for a week, or, I mean, I think the New York Times recently said that the evidence is that they've been dead and on the streets since March 19th or something. The Russians have been out of Bucha since March 30th. There was no evidence until April 2nd that there was like hundreds of dead bodies on the street. How could nobody have known for 2 or 3 days that a whole neighborhood had all these dead bodies after Russia had left? The mayor of Bucha had given remarks on camera celebrating how the city was now free. We're great, go victory. No mention of any dead bodies. No mention of a single case of Russians violently abusing the people while they were there in Bucha. Everybody had access to their internet and their phones. In this day and age, if there was actually Russian orcs going and abusing and raping and stealing from civilians and taking out their gold teeth, as one of the people, I think it was Zelensky, who even said this, they're taking blood-stained jewelry off the hands of the people that they massacre. If they were actually doing that, don't you think a single person would have filmed some of that Russian abuse or commented upon that before April 2nd? Not a single case. We just have cases of millions of tons of humanitarian aid being given by the Russians. And the people who actually do carry out that profile, if you actually listen to some of the interviews of people, reporters on the ground who are not tied to legacy media, there are still some courageous and honest reporters carrying out filming and talking to real Ukrainians. They'll tell you, I mean, you hear hundreds of testimonials of them saying, no, the Azovs are shooting at civilians. It's not the Russians. They're the ones shelling civilians. They're the ones using residential buildings as human shields. They're the ones camping out in hospitals and daycares and shooting it. Again, they avoid even often shooting at Russian soldiers because they know that they're going to be shot back on. But they know that they are indiscriminately allowed to shoot at Russians, especially the Russians that have a white patch on their arms to indicate to the Russians that we are friendly. Those are like less than human, Untermenschen, in the eyes of these Azovs. Zelensky's presidential advisor, I showed a video clip on my weekly show yesterday. His presidential advisor to Zelensky has given at least 2 interviews saying that he's been studying the ISIS playbook and justifies the use of torture and terrorism. He thinks that that's the policy for the future. Check out my interview on the Canadian Patriot website, and you could hear this guy in his own words saying this. Last thing, Dmitry Yarosh, one of the key founders of the Azov Battalion, is the lead advisor to the head of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. He was installed there after Victoria Nuland was kicked out of Russia in November of last year. And one of the first things that she ensured was that Yarosh, again, a Nazi, was made the head advisor of an Azov guy of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. So for people who say, oh, but Jews have nothing to do with Nazis in the case of Zelensky or Igor Kolomoskoy, no, not true. Actual point, I'm just going to continue on a little bit longer, I'm sorry. Actual last point here. Kolomoskoy, when you actually look at the Hunter Biden laptop, this is where it gets really interesting, because now people are a little bit more aware of the reality, people of biolabs, right? Bioweapons. This has been something that has been relegated to the domain of conspiracy theory for a long time. But no, Kolomoskoy is he's not only tied to Hunter Biden and Joe Biden on numerous levels. Number one is that I've just read an article last week going through how utilizing two shell companies in the British Cayman Islands or Virgin Islands, same thing ultimately. Kolomoskoy, this billionaire who owns Zelensky, owns all of the media that Zelensky works for, is also the primary owner and controller of Burisma Holdings, the biggest energy supplier of natural gas in Ukraine that was at the heart of the scandal of the Hunter Biden, graft that Joe had set into motion as viceroy of Ukraine under Obama. So not only was Hunter Biden reaping $50,000 a month, 10% to the big guy, according to his own emails inside of his laptops and beyond, but Kolomoskoy owns Burisma. Burisma was the company that the IMF was demanding that the Ukrainians pay double, triple the prices of their electricity while keeping their wages fixed back in 2013. You have the complicity from the highest echelons of power. Also, as another aspect, within the Hunter Biden laptops, which are now subpoenaed, I think that Hunter will be subpoenaed pretty soon, according to Matt Gaetz in the United States. There's a lot of hardcore evidence here of, who funded the bioweapons laboratories? Well, obviously the U.S. Department of Defense, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency as well, and the State Department and the Pentagon. So these were the funders of the 30 or so bioweapons. They call them bio-research facilities. They're only bioweapons labs when they fall into Russian hands, says Victoria Newland. But when we own them, they're just bio-research facilities studying anthrax, plague, coronavirus, blah. But who funded that? So it was the U.S. military-industrial complex. Who furnished it? Who furnished it with all of the facilities of Metabiota, right? Who runs Metabiota? Nathan Wolfe, who's a World Economic Forum young leader. Where did Metabiota come from? Well, it came as a startup in 2015 from Rosemont Seneca, Hunter Biden's company that gave Metabiota $30 million to start up their new company to be a contractor for the U.S. military and manage these biolabs. I think that there's a bunch in Georgia as well. China is looking at a whole bunch on their perimeter. You have EcoHealth Alliance that's also tied into this, that Rosemont Seneca is connected to, which Fauci, this is the thing that's been in people's mind, that Fauci was caught giving money to supply to the Wuhan lab for all sorts of U.S. directed bio research as well. My God, you have so many points of intersection here. We're scratching on such a nexus of evil and causation, which could easily be a game changer, right? Getting this exposed is one of the most important things right now, because it brings together so many different, apparently separate variables into a common thread. And the only way we're going to defeat this thing is by recognizing that this common thread is the Davos clique, which was established. And I guess I'll end it in like 5 minutes and open up for questions. The Davos clique was established as an operation coming out of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Bilderberger Group, right? Henry Kissinger's student was Klaus Schwab. Klaus Schwab's other mentor was Maurice Strong, one of the co-founders of the Club of Rome of Canada, which was brought into in the early 70s. Like I said at the beginning, right? Not only was the US dollar, and we were turned into this speculative, ideologically consumerist cult, but the idea of Kissinger was to create a world of dependency where we would be dependent on slave labor from China, of even lower third world exploitation of African resources. So you had the first, second, and third world under Kissinger's logic that were always supposed to remain these crystallized, fixed things, right? The first world was going to be like the dumb, wealthy people who would just consume but not produce. The second class people were going to be, maybe India, China, the people, Mexico, who would be allowed to produce sweatshops but never consume what they produced, still just being subsistence level. And the third world, the dark world, mostly Africa, was going to be the world where you wouldn't even have sweatshops. You would just have exploitation by Barrick Gold, De Beers, the other legacy projects of Cecil Rhodes, right? That are the corporations that control French Africa, English Africa, Belgian Africa, everything today, which still don't have independence. That was supposed to be the forever model in Kissinger's mind. That was what the Davos crowd was designed as sort of this junior low-level version of the Bilderberger group to enforce as a new culture of elitism, of transhumanism. And China was never supposed to break free from that. Africa was never supposed to break free. Russia was supposed to go the way of Zbigniew Brzezinski's, balkanized little micro state of maybe 12 different little micro states of federations beholden to the bankers to be used the way Hitler wanted as a slave society, a Slav, society, right? To be just used for resource extraction and slave labor, and that's it. So the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the Iranians, right now, we see that these ancient civilizations currently have real human leaders that don't want to sacrifice their civilizations on the altar of some mass kill. In the West, we don't have such leaders, unfortunately. We have people like, Klaus Schwab is right when he says we penetrated, the government of Canada, and now we have young leaders in half of the Canadian government and the opposition party. He's right. Like, they did a damn good job. Look at this bubblehead, Trudeau. That's the best we got right now as a national leader. Look at Biden, synthetic shell of a nothing of a personality, just an older version of Trudeau. These are the types of Borg-like synthetic constructs that they've put into positions of managerial authority here in the West, where the real power is we know above that. The idea here is a closed system. They want to use, just like in 1929, they want to use the trauma of the oncoming economic collapse of the West that they have orchestrated in order to create a trauma psycho-spiritually such that people will then accept owning nothing and being happy, right? The type of subhuman life that nobody in a normal society would ever allow their consciences to abide by. That's what they expect people to do. They expected Russia and China to be in on that controlled demolition. If it was 10 years ago, that's why George Soros was saying all these nice things about China in 2010, because they liked that 2010 China before Xi Jinping, before the Belt and Road, before the alliance with Russia, before the investments into the Middle East or Africa, before Russia began to put their body into the in front of the regime change and stop the regime change of Syria, or later Venezuela, or Kazakhstan, or, look at all of the failures, right, of attempted regime changes. Everything up until 2013-14 was working really well. And then the New World Order script stopped working because these countries don't want to sacrifice themselves on a sacrificial altar. And they're now fighting to create and bring online a new type of operating system, because there will be a new operating system. Theirs is actually based on the sorts of better principles of economic sanity. I mean, Russia is now returning back to a gold-based ruble. They're calling for settling oil payments, breaking the petrodollar in rubles. That's a game changer. Many countries are going along with that. Countries even in Europe who are saying they're not going to are actually in back rooms agreeing that they're going to have to do it. Germany is not going to be able to cut themselves off, even though Zelensky is lecturing the Europeans. He just did this last week, saying what a great opportunity this is for you Europeans to now wear extra sweaters and liberate yourselves from oil and gas in order to go green, to have windmills and solar panels. So he's sounding like Klaus Schwab, which is really about depopulation. Ultimately, this closed system great reset idea of those controlling Klaus Schwab, they want to get a big mass culling of the human herd. They think of humans like animals. If you actually look at like how they define humans, that's all we are, is eaters, poopers, pollution makers. And they don't recognize the validity of the idea that we're made in the image of a creator, that we have these creative attributes and can participate in the self-perfectibility of creation the way the founding fathers, or Thomas More, or Augustine, or Cicero, or Plato all had a firm faith that we have this higher attribute of something divine that could, that is the foundation for natural law. If you're going to have a society, a republic that is able to endure and not periodically fall into cyclical self-destruction, that's the challenge of the Republic by Plato, is how do you break the cycle of tyranny to anarchy and tyranny to anarchy? You got to get philosopher kings. You got to get people to have a culture that induces or awakens their hearts and their desires to come into alignment with their duty, with their reason. So your passion and reason have to be able to mature. That's what the founding fathers had set as a challenge for the Declaration of Independence, as well as the Constitution, which seemed to be very antithetical. The Declaration is all about inalienable individual rights and liberties. That's true. But then some people who are dichotomized in their thinking will say, but then how can you have a nation based upon the general welfare of the population as is in the Constitution? How is that true? The general welfare is all about the good of the whole. That is often disruptive to whatever I want to do personally. So they cannot coexist. It's one or the other. No, the only way you can have a democracy and a true sovereign nation is if every individual can both do as John F. Kennedy says, attain the idea, the status of identity where they ask not what their country can do for them, but what they can do for their country. And you like it. You like doing good. You know through your reason that doing good is more satisfying and a higher pleasure than doing evil, right? Even though it might be more sensually gratifying in the moment, maybe to do something which has an evil twist to it, it's actually going to hurt your conscience. It'll hurt your soul. The health of your soul will be sickened, which ultimately is a higher displeasure than the pleasure you get from satisfying and doing good for your soul, from teaching, from doing, even if it involves some material pain or sacrifice. So that's something that, again, it's not there in the equations of the computer programmers, these transhumanists who want to get us all into their hard drive, their computer game, and then reset it. That's how they're thinking. It's that superficial. And then create this like new type of human race that's more well-behaved in accordance with their programming. That's not in conformity with anything that we can find in nature. And again, when you look at Russia, China, India, other countries, they're awakening the better traditions that used to be foundational to the Judeo-Christian Western so-called, cultural traditions. So all that to say, I'll end it there. That's the fight. I had a whole PowerPoint. I didn't do any of that. There's a couple of books. A lot of what I'm going through, if you want to dig in a little bit more, I wrote 4 volumes of The Untold History of Canada, which tackles this from various ways, and also 2 volumes of the, I'm going to do a shameless plug here, okay? 2 volumes of The Clash of the Two Americas.
Okay, yeah. That's the
and they're just 2 books going through unknown history of the United States from this angle and the future. I'll open up for questions if people want to throw anything at me.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Sure.
Pat, I cannot oh, there you are. Yeah, I can hear you.
You hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you can. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just check.
Can you hear this?
It's weak, but I can squint my ears and kind of make it out.
Okay, thanks again, Matt. Another hand, guys. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you. Appreciate the summary. Very well done. Really nice. Then I open for questions. Yeah. And sorry, guys, you're actually going to have to come up here and ask the question because we have the same problem. Okay, Kayla. So we're going question.
Question.
Yeah, question.
There we go.
Okay.
Sit there.
Hi. It's Matt, right?
Yeah.
Hi, Matt.
Hi.
First of all, I want to say thank you for being so knowledgeable because you know your shit, and that's really cool because a lot of people just don't. So I really appreciate it on everything, like the banking cabal and Bitchute and all of it. So I've got 2 questions. The main one is, and it was the same question that I asked Eamon last week. So, given that you understand about the deficit and the West and their agenda, do you think Russia and China are part of this, and this is all just playing into the hands of you will own nothing and be happy by hiking the energy prices, rah, 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 rah? Or do you think they're fighting against this kind of Schwab, New World Order stuff? Number 1. And number 2, we all keep talking about problems, but what are the solutions? What do we do as normal people that are sort of more aware and alert to this? Because we know it now, but how do we fight against it, I guess? So those 2 questions.
Okay, yeah, those are good questions.
Sorry, we've got to give a hand for Kayla for that wonderful question. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. Those are both great questions. For the first one, I just had the privilege of participating in a debate hosted by Whitney Webb on her Unlimited Hangout and Kit Knightley last week with myself and a colleague representing the Russia and China are not evil versus a couple of opponents who were of the view that no, Russia and China are evil and everybody is in on it. I will email that to Pat actually, and you can maybe include that when you send out an email to people as a follow-up to address my assessment of Russia and China. The reason why I am of the view that I think it's pretty clear that Russia and China are not in on it is by going beyond their simple words, because I think that most of the arguments I've seen so far rely on the fact that Russia and China use words like new economic order, sustainability, UN sustainability goals. There's a lot of words that overlap what we know are embedded in the Great Reset programming as part of their Orwellian selling of their Great Reset. Or people will comment upon the technocratic elements of especially China, right, which has a large use of social credit, surveillance, very uncomfortable things. I'm not comfortable with that. And I wrote an article last year. It's a 3-part series. It's part of my new book coming out soon on the deep state of China. Going through, it's called Social Credit and Mass Surveillance as Distasteful Necessities in an Age of Asymmetrical Warfare, which goes through essentially all of the different CIA penetration of the Chinese establishment. I mean, over 1.5 million people have been punished and purged who are members of the Chinese Communist Party since 2012 for being on the payroll in varieties of ways of US intelligence, Soros-connected operations, even though Soros himself was banned from China in 1989. So there's been an effort to purge a lot of the deep state, and to do that, unfortunately, there is an intention to break up and destroy China. Like it's not just that was like a 19th century opium war dream. It's been a continuous agenda to pull China back into the program of Henry Kissinger of being allowed to do. They're not being obedient, right? When you actually look at their performance of what they've done, especially in the last 25, 30 years, especially since they kicked out George Soros, I would say that was a big shift. In 1989, there was an attempted coup d'etat in China where George Soros's agent, Zhao Ziyang, was first premier, and then he was Chinese Communist Party Secretary General for 2 years, up until 89. And he was sold as this liberalizing beacon of capitalism. He was sold as the Gorbachev-Yeltsin of China. So just as they had Gorbachev setting into motion this perestroika, which was carried out by CIA tool Yeltsin in Russia, under the control of Strobe Talbot, Rhodes Scholar, and his assistant Victoria Nuland in Russia, George Soros's asset, who ran a think tank with George Soros, Zhao Ziyang, was being set up to be the sort of the dictator of China, who was going to, he had already massively liberalized China. He brought in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He gave a speech in 1989. I cited in chapter 17 of this book, calling for a Fourth Industrial Revolution in China. This is an old term. There's a fight over what the definition of that term is going to be. But I mean, this guy was he was bringing in the futurists. He was bringing in Milton Friedman into China. He was doing all this stuff. And he was going to be the one who was going to set up a private central bank the way that they were doing in Russia. That was going to fully do a Russian Yeltsin operation in China. But again, when that operation funded by Soros, controlled by people like Bush Sr. was on the ground at Tiananmen Square. So was Gene Sharp, the godfather of modern color revolutions, was on the ground in Tiananmen Square. It was a complete CIA operation, kind of like a Maidan of Ukraine. If you want to get Tiananmen Square, look at Maidan 2014, same thing. Provocateurs, everything. There's pictures of like 30 Chinese soldiers who were burnt to death, strangled, and their corpses burnt to death. It wasn't a peaceful thing, and it was not a massacre of students. That's been a mythology created and promoted for 30 years. Even a lot of Chinese have been induced to believe this, just to get that across. But it failed. It failed to succeed. And what happened? Soros was given a lifetime forever ban, as were all of his open society operations. And Zhao Ziyang was put into house arrest for 14 years where he rotted and died, never allowed to do anything. And all of his allies were either arrested or were avoided arrest through Operation Yellowbird, which you can go on Wikipedia and read about this thing. Was run by the triads, MI6 and the CIA through Hong Kong, where they were able to bring out all of the provocateurs, as many as possible, and give them safe sanctuary via Hong Kong, that they sent them into the United States and Canada, where they were given, flush jobs, scholarships, other things, and became an anti-Chinese grouping of Chinese beholden to a master class working from the outside. And I think when you look at things like Falun Gong, Epoch Times, I think if you start digging into some of the personalities behind this operation who have Chinese names, you'll find that just like the Americans who escaped to Canada to destroy America from the outside in 1783, right? Canada's been a British-controlled operation subverting the U.S., killing American presidents, JFK, Lincoln, both deaths coordinated from Montreal, Canada, utilizing, the great-grandchildren of traitors, people who were loyalists to the British. So the same thing happened there too. It's the same technique. We have it also in Russia too, where a lot of Russians who were expelled from Russia or avoided arrest. And this all gets at your answer to your question. I think you realize, for those who avoided arrest, because the question is why did they not keep Zhao Ziyang in? If China is actually such a big part of the Davos operation, why didn't their Soros stooge remain in power? Why didn't the Davos crowd keep control? Why did China utilize national state-controlled banking to fund large-scale infrastructure, which really blossomed after 2012, 2013 with the Belt and Road Initiative? Why did Russia not keep their Yeltsin stooges in place? Why did instead we have a nationalist revival around Primakov and his prodigy Putin, who has put oligarchs into prison? For those oligarchs who avoided prison, they were forced to seek sanctuary in London, where you have Moscow on the Thames, right? Or Florida or New York, where they've been working with Soros, running external anti-Putin, anti-authoritarian, pro-democracy operations to subvert Russia from the outside. Why has that been going on for the past 25 years? Why did Anatoly Chubai, one of the key privatizers of the 90s, why did he just jump ship just now? And I could see that the Russians and the Chinese have been looking very, very carefully at the U.S. bioweapons capabilities that back with the Project for a New American Century in the Rebuilding America's Defenses white paper in September 2000, it's very clear that 21st century warfare is going to be based upon genetic targeting of pathogens that could target specific ethnic groups, Slav, Han, Chinese, other, Iranian. This has been a high focus openly by the thing controlling the United States. And the Chinese and the Russians have been very concerned by the growth of international US bioweapons laboratories. I think that they've been sort of on DEFCON 2 and looking at China's approach. China's in DEFCON 2 mode, and they have been since the very start of COVID. So when you look at their overreach, it's largely because they need to stay in control of what they perceive to be easily a deployable pathogen that could be targeting the Han Chinese or the Slavs racially. So that's where I think there's been that. On the other hand, too, you do have deep state operations. Like I've mentioned, Anatoly Chubai, a big chunk of the network that was built up in the 90s is still in Russia. For some reason, these groupings who center around Sberbank, the Russian central bank, have a lot of protection. I don't fully understand all of it. A lot of it's tied to the introduction of big pharma and big pharma practices into Russia. I don't fully know, but I do know that there is a fight. I've seen a lot of evidence, especially under COVID, that the federal authorities around Putin, the nationalists, have at various times tried to fight against the overreach of the regions who have been granted massive authority under COVID emergency protocols by the World Health Organization, which has been done in every nation of the world, right? Federal authorities have been bypassed in favor of the logic that, well, on the ground, governors and mayors know best. So they have the authority to pass mandates outside of any constitutional legislation that would be there under normal times. And we've got people like the mayor of Moscow, the mayor Sobyanin, who's been a part of this hive of evil for a long time. Tatiana Golikova, who's the deputy prime minister of Russia. She's the one in charge of all the COVID response protocols. She's devolved authority. And so there's been a fight for 2 years between the federal and the local authorities. We've seen similar examples of that in China too, where there's been fights against bringing in the Pfizer and other mRNA gene modifying things that they call vaccines. There's been a fight against that. That was the first question. So, I know that I'm running on. Wait. I set all this up. So let me just quickly, 30 seconds.
Sure.
All right. So all that to say, there's definitely a fight to keep control of the narrative. Russia, since the Ukraine process has really unleashed, we've seen a massive pullback on a lot of the mandates. They were basically saying, well, we played by the game, the narrative for a while. We didn't want to create unnecessary fissures, but now the fissures are here. So since February, there has been a massive pullback of the vax mandates in Russia. Again, China under Shanghai right now, I think they're expecting an attack. And if you look at what they're doing, everything that they're doing is antithetical in terms of providing industrial growth, large-scale infrastructure and energy policies that are the opposite of what is demanded by those in the Great Reset crowd who want to create constraints to growth and destroy nations and create more division. China and Russia and India and Iran and other countries working with that other nexus are doing the opposite. They're encouraging massive investment into industrial growth. New scientific discoveries are being brought online, and how technology of the fourth industrial revolution, which is just AI, 3D printing, machine learning, what else? Quantum computing. These are not intrinsically bad things. Having a digital currency even. I know this is not intrinsically an evil thing. If it's tied to reality and if it's tied to an intention and design to pull people out of poverty and give them a better way of life, it's not going to enslave, kill, and be a weapon to hurt you. So these are neutral, like any, a hammer can build a house or kill your neighbor. So these types of modern technologies there's a fight over how they're going to be used. And are they going to be used, like I said, to enslave or not? And I think as far as the social credit is concerned, in China, it's part of their survival basket right now. Like they're trying to purge their deep state and they're under attack. Like there's a war. So it's not like we could just talk about China just being this thing. Last thing, their one-child policy, that was Club of Rome. That was Kissinger. That was not Chinese back in 1979. So yeah, that was not a Chinese policy. And they're trying to overcome that and heal themselves from that destruction. And as far as your question on the solutions, first, we have to really understand that, because that's the only viable fight in town right now. There's no other viable fight against this new world order except what's coming out of Eurasia. And unless we fully understand that, we cannot navigate in any part of the world that we live appropriately. Like the fight is happening. It's right there, and too many people just don't see it.
Thank you. Brilliant. Okay. So we've got another 5 minutes to slip in another question. So anyone's got a question?
I can't think of any question.
Okay. Anyone? Okay. So sorry. Yeah, we're back to 10 minutes max. Is that good?
We have how much time? 5 minutes, you said?
About 5 minutes, 10 minutes maximum. Yeah. Okay. So here's a question from Pat.
Let me ask this question before you ask the question. How many other questions are there in queue? Because that I might just answer in like 30 seconds if there's a bunch.
Question? Just ask them in 30 seconds anyway. Yeah. Anyone have a question? No? Okay. This might be the question.
All right.
Yeah.
Hey, Matt. Love to buy your moose head and sit down and talk about your historical narrative. I'm very impressed with your take on the geopolitical perspective and the history. You touched on the spiritual aspect a little bit. Do you want to expand a little bit more on that? We're in this war, a spiritual battle, the good and evil, the wolf in sheep's clothing behind the Masonic order, the Jesuits, the long-range planning of these, satanic elements. There has to be a strong spiritual component on the negative side, but also on the positive side. Have you got a take on that? And you can elaborate more.
Yeah, sure. That's a great way to end it. Yeah, absolutely.
I've got one more question after that, but it's a yes or no. Okay, so
okay. The other one's a yes or no. Okay. Yeah. Look, I think that there's this tendency that I think we're all aware of sometimes of projection, right? We all find ourselves guilty of this at different times, where we evaluate the other from our own filter, and we project ourselves, our attributes, for good or for bad. You know, sometimes people are like, I'm a good person, so I'm going to presume that the other person is good and honest too, right? Honest Iago. That is a good thing, that we're often good and we project, but it ultimately is naive. And like Jesus said, it's good to be as wise as a serpent and soft as a dove. And so you want to balance both that idea of having that childlike innocence and faith and goodness, but not the mind that doesn't understand evil. So you want to be able to have the wisdom to know reality, but also have that pure childlike innocence and heart, right? Because only the children will make it into the kingdom of heaven, you know, as that Bible story goes. And I think that there's truths. There are these truths contained in various works of different traditions. We see these same lessons contained in various ways in Zoroastrianism, in the works of a lot of Hindu literature. We see these basic lessons, right, of being both innocent and having faith in the goodness of creation, at the same time being aware that there is evil, and balancing the two. On the other side, you have a tendency also of projecting our own negative attributes onto the other. So on the one hand, H.G. Wells, who was a leading Fabian, you know, wolf in sheep's clothing character, he once made the point, I think it was in his autobiography, that the greatest tool that the British Empire has is people's unwillingness to think of evil. And I thought that was very insightful, because he's aware that people's inability or unwillingness to think of the nature of evil is actually an asset for the empire, who's going to infiltrate, penetrate, and do evil. But people don't believe in it. Or the devil's greatest trick is to convince you we didn't exist, right? I think the thing with and that's because people are ultimately good. I think ultimately there's a natural goodness inherent in every baby. And even H.G. Wells, if he was given different opportunities growing up, he probably could have been a wonderful, loving person, but he wasn't. He was given a shitty education in England. He was given a teacher who was a misanthropic anti-humanist named Thomas Huxley, who was his patron and mentor. And he developed this really robust, creative hate for humanity, based on certain presumptions, certain experiences. Probably had some abuse as well, that they process. I mean, there's systemic abuse that they process their own kids through in Eton, in a lot of these elite colleges, which it's disgusting. You know, there's a movie, was it the Good Shepherd with Matt Damon that was just a few years old, going through just some of that abuse, this degenerate stuff that if you want to become a member of the Skull and Bones, you have to, like, you know, get pissed on, fight naked and shit and all this stuff. But that's even like low level. It probably gets even worse. That they then break something inside of the soul that then creates a climate whereby those who are processed through that sort of experience, plus the intellectual brainwashing of Cambridge or Oxford, or the London School of Economics, puts ideas in your head which, tied to those types of rotten emotional distortions, will create somebody who will be a useful Borg zombie, detached from their own humanity. Ultimately, there's this thing where they're trying to impose they're projecting their own ugliness onto what they see humanity as, and they're trying to keep us into a society of anti-creative limits. Why? It's because human beings, when we're human, I think there's all sorts of evidence that we tap into a divine source, which allows us the type of creative flexibility to make discoveries of look at Da Vinci, or Da Vinci-like mind that's so flexible and playful, but yet rigorous with everything that they give their passion to willfully, right? And Da Vinci was able to make penetrating breakthroughs in everything that he came into contact with. There was not a field of anatomy, of music, of engineering, painting that he did not revolutionize. It's not because he had a special magic ball or a source, like a magic ring. He just was a human being who was very well integrated, and he was tied to a political experience, working with figures in Florence to fight the Venetians. He was working with Machiavelli as part of the 1508-1509 League of Cambrai, building machinery, building equipment to keep Florence as part of a coalition of sovereign nations with France and Spain and Germany together working against this evil Venetian rot, which that was the League of Cambrai. It was a fight to destroy Venice from the face of the earth, which ultimately only partially succeeded. And then Venice was able to sabotage it, destroy Machiavelli. Da Vinci had to seek sanctuary in France to avoid death. But all to say, like, they're tapping into like the source, and it just requires self-awareness, self-discipline, and a love. Like, you really do have to love your fellow man and love God, like the way Jesus said, right? He basically was asked a trick question, like, well, which one of the 10 commandments is the most important? And he's like, he didn't play that game. He's like, he didn't pick any of the 10 commandments. He said, love God, love your fellow man. Because if you actually do love that way, the real love, you will implicitly do all of those other 10 things. You don't have to be told to do any of that, you know? So if we actually do act in accordance with that love, and you'll find yourself able to create open systems, to create rules. Like, if the game is rigged, if you're in a rigged game that's going to kill you, you don't play by the rules of the game, right? You can create a new situation that changes the rules. And that's why the oligarchy hates new creative discoveries, new inventions, because every time a new one is brought online, like, let's say we have fusion energy. That fusion energy, cold fusion, hot fusion, it's been sabotaged for like 40 years. If that were permitted to be not only occur, so if the schools were actually wired in such a way that encouraged creative thought, we would not only have way more breakthroughs happening than we currently do. That's a self-sabotage. But if we actually had an economic system that was flexible enough to allow for the introduction of new discoveries, instead of just keeping them either sucked in the military industrial complex or just flushed, what often happens is Lockheed Martin will put their money behind a promising venture, a promising creative discovery. And as soon as it starts like bearing fruit, they own the patents, they've put all their money into it, and then they'll like put it in a little box and light it on fire and make sure that the scientist dies depressed. So that's a system, like I said, the Roman Empire, right? It's encrusted. It's too well adapted, like the dinosaurs, to the ecosystem that it's in. It cannot, it's so adapted that it can't move. It can't change according to the new necessities. Like an asteroid hitting killed all the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs couldn't create a NASA. They couldn't create anything new. So we're in that sort of situation on the Earth, in a universe which seems to be creative, that seems to be directed by creative evolution. We're made in the image of that universe. And I think everybody from all, there's everybody from Chinese history, Indian history, all cultures have a tendency of bringing out that Renaissance characteristic in humanity, which unites us, makes us look for the universal, and makes us break free of systems that are going to kill us. So, okay. Yeah, that's the spiritual approach I'm looking at.
Thank you. And the last question, yes or no question?
Okay, so you're very well researched. So I'm just curious on your take: heliocentric or geocentric?
Helio. I'm not into the flat Earth stuff.
Okay, all right. Right on. All right, Matt. Thank you.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Matt, just one last question. So, how do you see the future?
I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist. I generally see the future. I would be a lot more depressed if you did not have a Eurasian alliance of these great cultures working together with a decent sense of the evil, and a decent sense of natural law that they're striving towards. If that wasn't on the table right now, I'd probably be a hell of a lot more depressed and less positive. I'd still be a positive person, but there wouldn't be as much to hold on to,
Great. So how often are you invited to talk and appear on podcasts by different groups around the world? Do you think it makes a difference? Like, for example, us having our group here. This is on Little Koh Samui. I'm sure you've talked to a lot of groups around the world. Yeah, does it sort of give you hope?
Sure, the hunger is huge.
Forcing you to say yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's such a hunger for discoveries right now. I think that the people's bell curves for the past 2 years especially has just been astronomical. And I got to say, I've been writing the Canadian Patriot magazine since 2012. I was not getting a lot of traction between 2012 and 2016, 17. I was not getting a lot of resonance with the world. And it's really just with the overthrow of the Hillary project in 2016, and a certain sense in people's minds that maybe this New World Order thing is a bit weaker than they thought it was, a lot weaker. that there's this huge hunger, and especially since the whole COVID thing was thrown at us, people have just been like making a high density of discoveries, and they're hungry. So there's a lot of that. And I'm giving like 20 presentations or interviews every week. It's a bit exhausting, but it's gratifying, and I'm getting a lot of heart out of it. Yeah, and I love what you guys are doing. This is a great project you guys have going on. I know if I was in Thailand with my wife, we'd be there right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much again. Big hand from your audience. I really appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much, man. And so this thing, I'll post your stuff in our chat group, your books and everything, yeah? I'll post
Sure, I'll send you an email and you can send it out.
Brilliant. Okay, again, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone listening. Cheers.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.